So for today, our speaker today is Brooks Laudin. Brooks Laudin. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Brooks? Good enough. All right. I never know. I'm lousy at that. Brooks is a founding member and head docent of the Cobra Experience. He's been a Shelby enthusiast and owner for 30 years, including 29 trips on the annual Cobra 1000 tour, which is the stupidest tour I've ever heard of. They go out in the snow and everything, and these guys are nuts. And the guy right in front of me, Drew, is the guy that's responsible for all this craziness. More recently, his garage has attracted a 65 GT350 and a black 1931 Chop Bob Highway Ford that survived 2 hot rod power tours with grandsons on the East Coast. I saw this car when he drove it from the East Coast here, and it had more bugs on it than it had paint. But he drove it here. Really dumb idea, but he did. And a solo drive across the country, all while running 6 Ford Model 94 carburetors. That's another story. Maybe he'll relate to that a little bit. His first car was a 70.5 Cobra Z28, so he's really a GM guy. Interior and radio delete with a close ratio M22 rock crusher and a 411 gear. It's quite a first car. Fortunately, gas was below 50 cents a gallon, at least for a while. He grew up in boat high country. Somewhere along the line, he saw the light. Brooks is a long-term transplant from Norroy, Massachusetts, but we don't begrudge him his Pilgrim background. He's here today to tell us about the museum, some of its exhibits, and a bit about the Shelby story, the latter told from a different perspective of inflection points. Please welcome Brooks Laudin.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to try to do this with this here. Let's see how that goes. Well, that's going to do it.
Pointed away from the speaker.
Is that better? Got it. There, that'll do it. Thank you, Gary, for that kind introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here on behalf of the Cobra Experience to tell you a bit about what we have going on in Martinez, and more of it really about the background and why that museum is there. You know, it would be easy to stand up here and talk about Carroll Shelby. Get that better. It'd be easy to stand up here and talk about Carroll Shelby, but that's really kind of a well-trodden path. You know, the guy was born in 1923. The family was dirt poor. His dad was a rural postman and drove a horse and buggy on his route. Carroll Shelby was 4 years old before the family had a car. He was not a well child, and so he was not athletic. Barely made it out of high school. Literally like one of the 2 at the bottom of the class, but got into Georgia Tech, which I don't really understand. In any event, in April of '41, he decided rather than go to college, he would go join the Army Air Corps. He flew various types of planes, most of them twin engine, while the Air Force, the Army Air Corps, was training bombardiers and navigators. So he spent the entire war as a second lieutenant flying around West Texas, helping guys learn how to drop bombs and get where they were supposed to go. He himself never made it into battle, but he did fly virtually everything that was made at the time up to a B-29. He was married in 1946 to Jean Fields. They had 3 kids. He was divorced from her in 1960. While all of this was going on, he started his racing career in 1952 in a kind of a beater MGTC. A year and a half later, he was in Argentina with Phil Hill, among others, racing in a Grand Prix down there. In March of 1954, he was racing for Aston Martin at Sebring. A very atypical approach to big league racing. Of course, today you'd start at 4 years old in a go-kart. He started at 22 or 3 years old in a beater foreign car. Shelby was the occasional driver for Aston Martin for the next few years, up to and including winning at Le Mans in 1959. In 56 and 7, he was named Sports Car Driver of the Year, and he was the SCCA National Road Racing Champion. In 1960, he won the USAC Road Racing Championship, but his health was failing. The heart issue had caught up with him. He couldn't pass the physical, and so at that point, he was divorced with 3 kids, and really didn't have 2 nickels, basically broke, 2 nickels to rub together. A buddy of his set him up with the Goodyear racing tire distributorship west of the Mississippi, and that's a business that the Shelby family still runs. And another buddy set him up as a sales rep with Champion Spark Plugs. Get these things apart. Here we go. So, we're here today to look at the longer legacy, if you will, of Carroll Shelby. And that's the part that came after he was out of racing. That's the Shelby American part of it. I want to look at it from inflection points. This came to me actually a few weeks ago that it would be an interesting way to look at the Shelby experience. And with apologies to the mathematicians here, I'm told that the inflection point in mathematics can be determined by dividing the second derivative of the first derivative by your shoe size. In business, an inflection point can be determined, its success or failure can be determined by the results of what happens with the business. Carroll Shelby, and I want to get to slide 1 here, make sure I'm doing this right. So, I love this picture. It's one of my favorites lately. Carroll Shelby, this is the first inflection point. 1961, July of 61, Carroll Shelby met a guy named Dave Evans at the Pikes Peak Hill Climb. Shelby was there because he was representing Goodyear tires and Champion Spark Plugs. Dave Evans was there because he was a young engineer, had only been at Ford for a couple of years, but he was in charge of their stock car program. And you got to remember that both Ford and Chevrolet were signatories to the AMA ban on racing at the time. But here they are with factory guys all over the Pikes Peak Hill Climb. Shelby and Evans ran into each other, and the record's not clear if Shelby questioned, hey, do you have a small block V8? Or whether Evans told him, look, we're about to introduce a 221 cubic inch V8 engine. But the subject came up, and they had a conversation about the availability of this small engine, smaller V8 engine. Shelby, in the back of his mind, had always wanted to build a sport car. He called them sport cars, not sports cars. He wanted to build a sport car for he and his buddies. And he needed an engine to make that happen. He had in his mind the AC Ace as the target vehicle. Now, ACs had been around for a long time. The car was basically designed in 1953. The year that Shelby won Le Mans, an AC Ace finished 7th overall, averaging 100 miles an hour for the 24 hours. So he well knew the car. He knew they were losing their engine manufacturer. He was trying to put 2 and 2 together. But anyway, he and Evans parted ways, and Shelby was left to kind of ruminate on what he'd heard about a small block engine. The picture has nothing to do with Ford or even Dave Evans. We couldn't find a good picture, a usable picture of Curtis Turner, who finished second in the stock car section of the Pikes Peak Hill Climb in 1961. This is Louis Unser in a Chevrolet Impala with a 409 cubic inch engine. Curtis Turner was in a 1961 Galaxy with 3 deuces on a 390 cubic inch engine. In any event, the word on the race report is that Louis Unser, who was born in 1896, for instance, for example, and is running this car that we see in the picture, sandbag his qualifying time and to get better road conditions by starting earlier. Curtis Turner wasn't that experienced, and so he qualified first, ran last, and he lost to this guy by 0.4 of a second. Interestingly, their time was in like the 13-minute range. And of course, the times today are 7 minutes. It's been paved to the top, and the cars are weird now. But this was, go down to the dealership and buy one of these things and run it up the hill in 12, 13 minutes. By the way, Louis Unser entered this race 37 times and won it 9 times. Wow. In any event, the record is not clear how it came about, but by later in July and early in August, Shelby had contacted Chevrolet to see if they had any interest in providing small block engines. They sent them away, citing the fact that they had a Corvette and they weren't interested in anybody else starting up a sports car operation. In August, Shelby called Dave Evans at Ford, and Evans was much more receptive. Remember, he was a young guy, so he was into the new idea thing. But he thought he was talking to a Texas oil man, not a guy who didn't have two nickels to rub together. On his own volition, in September '61, Evans sent him 2 engines. They were 221 cubic inch engines. But he didn't send all the parts he needed to make any sort of an engine run. Those didn't show up until November. Meanwhile, Shelby made sure Ford was aware that he didn't have a lot of money behind him. He was not a Texas oil tycoon. And about that time, Evans brought his contact with Shelby to Don Fry's attention. Don Fry, a senior executive at Ford, knew who Shelby was, and with authorization from Lee Iacocca, who was the father of the Total Performance Program that Ford had undertaken that summer, authorized sending $20,000 to this guy and another couple of engines. As for the rolling chassis, meanwhile, this guy has no money, and he's starting a sort of a 2-card Monte game with AC cars in Europe, convincing them that he somehow had a relationship with Ford, and with Ford convincing them that he had a relationship with AC cars. That's what we call economical with the truth. In any event, Shelby fired off a letter to Charles Verloc at AC Cars to discuss his idea of how this sport car could proceed. And they were receptive. At that point, they were building rough AC cars, RUFF, which had a 6-cylinder Zephyr, Ford Zephyr engine in it, and they had redesigned the nose of the car to give that better cooling. Virtually the same design that they would employ in the Cobra. Ford transshipped an engine to AC Cars. It arrived in a crate and said FOMOCO on it, F-O-M-O-C-O. And the guys at AC Cars were wondering if it came from Japan or what this was. Anyway, they opened up the crate, figured it out, and put together a prototype, CSX 2000. That car sold for what, Drew? $13.7 million here not too long ago. In any event, the prototype arrived back in the States in February of 1962. So this picture represents an interaction with Lance Reventlow. I think it's way more interesting than a picture of the front of 1042 Princeton Avenue. As the spring of '62 unfolded, Ford and Shelby came to terms on a serial production of the Cobra. AC Cars would provide the rolling chassis, and Ford would provide the engine transmission in exchange for powered by Ford badges on the fenders. Shelby needed a place to build the thing. So here we have 2 canceled checks. Among the many on display at the Cobra Experience, X checks. You'll notice in the upper right corner they are X checks, which means they're a new account at Bank of America. And these were the temporary checks that were issued so that Shelby could get through his business affairs for a month or so, or a few weeks, while they got the regular checking account going. The bottom check is the first paycheck to Phil Remington. And we'll get to how that came about. But Phil Remington came with the property, Lance Reventlow's property, at 1042 Princeton Avenue. Pay period was 2 weeks to July 31, 1962, and Remington was earning $5 an hour. Per the notes at the top of the check, on the top check, it's a $200 loan to Joan F. Shelby, authorized by C. Shelby. The backstory is that Shelby and a bunch of his buddies went up to Harrah's resort or casino in Reno. Their group was called Los Vaqueros, the Cowboys, and Harrah knew who Shelby was and wanted to keep his buddy happy. So he signed a 24-year-old event coordinator to the group for the weekend to make sure everything went well. Her name was Joan Sherman, young blonde. Shelby somehow convinced this poor girl to come home with him as his roommate and business manager, which at the time involved his Goodyear tire distributorship, Champion spark plugs, and in the meantime he had started the Shelby School of High Performance Driving. When Ford became involved, Shelby thought it would look bad if he was sleeping with his assistant or his business manager. So for purposes of interaction with Ford, she became Joan Shelby, which, again, a bit economical with the truth. But by all accounts, she was the rock that kept his business interests alive in those early days. She, the high performance driving school reported to her. She ran the Goodyear tire distributorship. She would go out and get the tires, get them shipped. And his various phone calls from Champion or Goodyear and all that were all handled by Joan Sherman Shelby. What she likely didn't know was that his second marriage was being annulled about this time, in 1962. Ed Hughes was an old racing friend of Carroll Shelby's. They often talked at Le Mans. Hughes had been there for 10 or 12 years. And Hughes agreed to, he was not a wealthy man, but a man of enough wealth and owned a European car dealership in Pittsburgh. He said, look, I'll put up the money for the early Cobras till we get this thing established, in exchange for the distributorship for Cobras east of the Mississippi. In the end, deliveries from Thames didn't. AC cars were behind, and by July 1962, just 6 of the first 10 or so cars had been delivered. Those 6 having been delivered to Ed Hughes, where he was putting them together. Remember that Ford hadn't quite figured out what they had going on with Shelby yet, and he was very worried that Ford might somehow figure out that these things were being built in Pittsburgh by a guy with some money, and he was very concerned that Ford would just cut him out of the picture and move forward with Ed Hughes. In the end, what Shelby did was cut Hughes out of their handshake deal. Hard to imagine with 2 friends, but that's what he did. Hughes took it like a man and moved on. Lance Reventlow was the heir to the Woolworth fortune and funded Reventlow Automobile Incorporated in August of '57 with the goal of building an all-American sports car to take on the European marks. Reventlow built a total of 8 cars between 1957 and 1962. 3 of them were front-engine sport cars. The balance, a mix of mid-engine and front-engine sports cars and Formula One and Formula Libre Grand Prix cars. He sold 2 of the cars. The first 3, 2 of the first 3 were sold to the Meisterbrew team in Milwaukee. Those cars were entered in 93 races and earned 39 overall wins and 32 podium finishes. But those were the only 2 cars that Reventlow ever sold, and the IRS finally caught up with them. According to the IRS, you can't have losses in more than 5 consecutive years in a family business, or it's considered a hobby. So they closed in on Lance. He ran his business down in late '61 and early '62 from 20 employees to about 6. Including Emil Diet, who was his chassis had won the Indianapolis 500 on at least 2 occasions. He was also Mr. Louver in the hot rod scene in LA. Phil Remington was there. Leonard Parsons was running the shop, the work floor, and Warren and Simone Olson were running the business. Warren was the general manager, and Simone was running the parts and other parts of Italy. Shelby sublet that building from Lance Reventlow in 1962, and with money from Ford, bought the machine shop, the tools, and everything else that went with it, and picked up the payroll for all the employees. Hence, the bottom check being the first for Phil Remington, and the top check was probably repeated many times with various secretaries. Two grumpy old men. This is the third inflection point. So the first was, not a chance meeting, but a meeting with Dave Evans, at Ford. The business went off a different direction. The dream at that point went off in a different direction. The second inflection point is he stumbles into a guy who's going out of business that delivers him a shop, a fully fitted out shop, and employees to make it happen. Number three is the failure of Ford to gain control of Ferrari in the spring of '63. At the time, it was over, the negotiations were over in May. The bid from Ford was about $10 million. The ask from Ferrari was $17 million. Way too big a gap to close. They gave up the discussion. Fiat actually ended up investing some money in Ferrari. Some wonder if Ford wasn't used as a stalking horse. In any event, the negotiations ended, and Henry Ford, who was now not happy, said, we're going to go alone, we'll go take on Ferrari racing on our own. So, as they set out to beat Ferrari, they determined to send a group from Ford Planning, a guy named Hal Sperlich, Ray Geddes, who had been he's a young bean counter who had been at Ford a year maybe, who had been around in the very early negotiations, Roy Lund, who was a British engineer, to observe. They sent them to Le Mans in June of '63 to see what it would take to operate at Le Mans, and on the way home to search for somebody to build their vision of a GTP car, what would become the Ford GT40. Shelby went along as their guide, basically. Surely at Le Mans, he knew where to stay, where to go, how to get around, who to talk to, and all that. And given his reputation in Europe, was able to open doors on the way home. So these two were locked in battle at that point. Ferrari had nothing to gain or nothing to prove, and Ford had everything to gain. A fortune was about to be spent. After the race, the group continued on to England, where they visited with Colin Chapman at Lotus Cars, John Cooper at Cooper Car Company, and Eric Broadley at Lola Cars. In the end, Lotus was judged to have had enough interest already in the total performance program, as Ford was providing engines to the Lotus Cars. Cooper Cars was determined to be, too small, and Eric Broadley was thought to be just right. One too big, one too small, one just right. He was hungry, he needed money, and he just introduced the Lola Mark VI, which looks surprisingly like what Ford envisioned for a GT40 car. A deal was struck in July of '63, where Ford Advanced Vehicles was established. John Wyer was the general manager, Eric Broadley was to design and build the cars, and the whole operation would report to Roy Lund. Shelby himself had nothing to do with it, but he had been part of something that was now going to be coming his direction. Fast forward to June of 1965 in Le Mans. So we skipped most of '64 here for sure. That was the year that John Wyer was running the GT40 program, and it didn't go well. So Shelby had been handed the entire GT40 program at Christmas time '64 and then going into '65. Wyer had failed to win a race, or had failed to finish a race in 12 starts. In January '65, Phil Remington took apart the two remaining cars, GT103 and 104, so the real earliest Mark I cars, and made about 24 changes and took the cars to Daytona on February 28th, '65. There, Ken Miles and Lloyd Ruby finished first. An auspicious start, basically 60 days after they had received the cars. Richie Ginther and Bob Bonnarant finished third overall. At Sebring a month later, Miles and McLaren finished second overall behind a Ferrari prototype, as I remember it, and Ginther and Hill were a DNF. What we see in this photograph is at Le Mans in June of '65, at CSX 2299, race number 11 at the end of the race. It is severely beat up. Not only was the front bashed in, but down the side of it, it was just a mess. Hopes were running high for success with Ford and Shelby Camp as the team approached Le Mans in June. The team arrived with 11 cars, a mixed bag of GT40s, including the introduction of 2 Mark II big block cars, and 4 Mark I cars, plus 5 Daytona coupes. Ford and its related entities had over 100 people there to keep everything running. It all reported to Carroll Shelby. It was meddling from several sides, the most damaging being an unnamed Ford employee who wandered into the pits on the eve of the race, Friday night, and demanded that the Shelby engines be swapped out in favor of Ford engine and foundry engines. Mechanics were up all night, and the result was a disaster. One after another, the small block cars retired. Keep in mind that Ford was heavily involved in Indianapolis in May, and they had consumed all of their dyno time testing the Ford engines that were at the Indianapolis race. And literally, they just built these engines and put them in crates to ship them to Europe. It turned out they had faulty head studs, and which stretched and broke and caused all kinds of problems with the engines. The Mark IIs lasted a bit longer. They were 427 cubic inch power, the engine power, but were parked by lap 89, leaving the Daytona coupes to carry on. Their numbers dwindled with the same head bolt issue. Gurney and Jerry Grant went out in the 14th hour, leaving Jack Sears and Dr. Dick Thompson in this car to carry on. They would finish 8th overall, fortunately first in GT 5.0, 44 laps behind the winning Ferrari 250LM. Quick aside on that was the last time Ferrari won Le Mans until a couple of years ago. And they've now won it, I think, twice in the last couple of years. And even less known, I think, or recognized, is the fact that Ed Hughes was listed by his buddy Luigi Canetti as one of the drivers for the winning 250LM. Maston Gregory was one of the others, Jock and Rint was the third. Rint and Gregory were taking the stints. Gregory went out late at night and it was foggy and misty, and many of you will remember that he had Coke bottle glasses. His eyesight was horrible. He came back in and said it was dangerous for him to drive. They found Hughes stuck into the car and he finished the stint, and so it was part, I think it's widely recognized now, it's been proven, widely recognized, Ed Hughes was part of the team that won Le Mans in 1965. On the other hand, it was a disaster for Carroll Shelby. Where was he when the Ford exec wandered into the pits the night before the race and had the mechanics go all night? We can probably imagine where he was. But anyway, he was not there to tell the Ford guy to take a hike. Worse still, the only car that finished, this car, was managed by Alan Mann, who had been brought in to manage the racing effort for the Daytona coupes in Europe. Alan Mann had done some good work in '63 and even earlier for Ford and rally cars. Henry Ford's wife was quoted as saying at the end of the race, quote, "We came all this way for this." In any event, the cost of the failure was steep for Shelby. Not long after the race, Ford set up the Le Mans Committee, which included the department heads of each group at Ford that touched the Le Mans project. Meetings were twice per month, and attendance was mandatory. There would be no miscommunication. Carcraft, a Dearborn, Michigan independent engineering and fabrication shop, which was wholly contracted to Ford, but not owned by them, would assume the lead role in the development of the Mark II GT40s. Lastly, it was determined that no entity would manage more than 3 cars at the big races. Going forward, Shelby American would share the preparation of the GT40s with Holman and Moody, and race management would be split between Shelby American, Holman Moody, and Alan Mann. This is the beginning of the end. inflection point, the last one was obviously Shelby had control of the GT40 program, and now he's off in a slightly different role. The change in the GT40 program in August of '65 paid off when Shelby American and Holman and Moody led the way to a 1-2-3 sweep at Le Mans in 1966. Henry Ford loved it and decided he would give it one more go, but this time the effort would be all American. There would be no Italian carburetors, there'd be no foreign gearboxes. Every bit of the Mark IV GT40 was to be made in America. Carcraft took the lead in the design. The chassis was subcontracted to Brunswick Corporation, the bowling people. But they were also a government contractor in 1966, and Ford helicopters had developed a honeycomb material, two very thin sheets, 016 thick, sheets of aluminum with kind of cardboard matrix in between. The first chassis that Brunswick delivered back to Carcraft weighed 83 pounds. In August of '66, just a few weeks after the race, Ken Miles was killed in the second car built by Carcraft, and the program was put on hold. The Mark IV program was put on hold while Ford sorted out what happened. As an aside there, we've talked to mechanics who were at the track at Riverside that day, and when Miles came by the pits, there was smoke coming out from behind the front wheels. And the suspicion is that the car collapsed, this 83-pound chassis collapsed behind the front wheels, broke the various fluid lines, and the poor guy was just along for the ride off the end of the straightaway. In August, the Mark II big block 40s had been so successful in '66 were taken out of storage and reworked into the Mark IIB specification, largely by Holman Moody. The chassis were strengthened and a roll cage added. Ford went to work on the 427 cubic inch engines to make them more reliable. As the chassis was strengthened, the roll cage was added that put another 270 pounds on top of the 83-pound original chassis. Significant aero changes were made in the car that more than made up for the added weight. On the slide, we see the controversial finish of the 1966 Le Mans race. It was a result of an ill-advised effort to stage a 1-2-3 finish that ignored the rules that track position at 4 p.m. on Sunday was all that mattered. Ford could have staged this photo without having Miles relinquish an almost four-lap lead late in the race. Ken Miles was truly screwed out of the Grand Slam that may never have been repeated, which would have been the outright victory at Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans in the same year. Even worse, after Ken Miles died, Shelby went on the record and continued to talk about it until his grave, that he lamented the role that he played in allowing Ford to monkey with what would have been a spectacular finish at Le Mans. The Ford GT40 program at Daytona in 1967 was plagued by transmission issues, which all but took the factory cars out of the race, leaving two cars in 6th and 7th overall, 60 laps behind the winning Ferrari. And Ferrari went 1-2-3 that day to avenge their embarrassment at Le Mans in 1966. There were no J cars at Daytona. They hadn't quite figured out what they were going to do with those, and they were in process. The entry list was comprised of 6 Mark IIB and 3 independent Mark I cars. Given the poor performance of the Mark IIB transmission, the team used 9 spare transmissions plus 2 off of spare cars to keep the 2 Mark IIB cars running in the race. With this performance, the Mark IV program was now reinvigorated with an eye on Le Mans in just 3 months. Results improved at Sebring in April when a Mark IV and a Mark IIB came on 1st and 2nd overall. The Mark IV finishing 12 laps ahead of the 2nd place car. And this is a picture of the end. It's August '67. Shelby American is struggling with the introduction of the 1967 GT350 and 500 models. The plan in the spring had been to introduce 6 models in the fall: a coupe, a convertible, and fastback body, each with either a 289 or a 428 special interceptor engine. Remember, in '65, Shelby American offered 1 model in 1 color. In '66, it was 1 model in 5 colors. Plans for '67 were ambitious, to say the least, and in the end, far outstripped the capabilities of Shelby American to pull it off. The struggle really revolved around the sourcing of fiberglass Shelby parts and pieces that SAI, the Shelby American, needed to add to the cars being shipped from Ford. Hoods, side scoops, front valances, and badges were ordered from existing suppliers in the Los Angeles area, and quality and delivery times were very poor. The traditional September model year introduction was missed badly and was pushed back to November 10th for the 1967 Shelby dealer launch. On the slide, we see rows of unfinished '67 fastback Mustangs lined up on the apron outside the Shelby production hangar. The 289 Mustangs had begun to arrive in numbers in October, but the 428 Mustangs did not start to arrive until December. They were way off the mark. Ford took notice of this delay and took drastic action. In September, they sent a guy named Fred Goodell, an engineer, to Los Angeles to look things over and determine next steps. He spent some time going back and forth between LA and Detroit, and the first decision that was made was to drop the coupe and the convertible from the lineup after only 1 each was built. He became an employee. Those 2 cars have become fairly famous in their own right as a result of that, although they're not considered prototypes. They just were built and then never built any other. Fred joined the payroll at Shelby American on December 5th, fired the existing chief engineer, and hired A.O. Smith, the water heater people. We had bowling people earlier, and now we have water heater people. But anyway, to produce the fiberglass parts in Canada. At the same time, Ray Geddes, who had been around Shelby American since the earliest days, assumed responsibility for all of Shelby American, not just the racing side. A.O. Smith parts began to arrive in the winter, and production finally hit its stride in the spring, but it was too late for Shelby American. It appears that Ford assumed full control of Shelby American in April of 1968, to the point that proceeds from sales of the Shelby Mustangs no longer passed through Los Angeles. They went directly to Ford in Detroit. In August of '68, Shelby American was broken up into 3 pieces. Shelby Parts Company and the Shelby Racing Company would stay with Carroll Shelby and move to much smaller headquarters in Torrance, California. Shelby Automotive would be wholly owned by Ford and license the GT350 and 500 name from Shelby. The product and Shelby's name would be paid back to Shelby as long as they continued the relationship. The production headquarters would move to Detroit. A.O. Smith was hired to produce the Shelby badged vehicles, assemble the vehicles going forward. Shelby Racing would continue to build Group 2 Trans Am cars for another 2 years, and field a 2-car team for Ford in the factory Trans Am series. Shelby actually won the Trans Am series 2 years in '66 and '67. That effort would end altogether in August '69 when both Shelby Racing Mustangs, both Shelby team cars, were tangled up in a 14-car wreck started by George Fuller in another Ford factory car, mass Mustang, up at San Jovite in Canada. So the final inflection point was in the fall of '67, when production difficulties coincided with Ford's exit from the GT40 program and the December end of the lease on the LAX properties. Ford decided it would be easier and financially advantageous to bring production of the Shelby Mustangs back to Detroit. A little bit about the museum. It's now in its 12th year. Open to the public on schedule for special events and tours. So we're open the 3rd Sunday of every month from 10 to 3. Those open days are preceded at 8:30 by a car show with coffee and donuts. Otherwise, give Drew a call. If you've got a group, we can make an appointment and get you in to take a look around. It is a 501c3 operation in 25,000 square feet in a commercial building in Martinez, California. Full-time staff and about 20 volunteers keep the place running. About 24 cars are available in the museum on any given month on a rotating basis. About 75,000 images, some on the walls, most digitized, or in storage in our reference library. About 50,000 related documents, Ford and Shelby related documents. Some are on display, most are digitized, and the balance are in storage in the library. About 7,500 artifacts are on the walls, or on display, or stored in the reference library, including, for instance, the 2 checks we looked at a few minutes ago. The digitized and accessible registry of 2,000 and 3,000 series original Cobras is housed and operated out of the museum. We have established partnerships with Team Shelby and local nonprofits. We have a community outreach program that includes, among others, quote, "What's the third pedal for?" where we teach licensed drivers to drive stick shift. One of the cars that's often used was featured in the movie Ford versus Ferrari. The Cobra 1000 is now in its 37th year. As Gary mentioned, I've been on 29 of them, much to Drew's dismay. But anyway, the family continues to produce that event that those of us that are lucky enough to be involved truly enjoy. For 2025 alone, the other thing that the other tour is run, how many years have you been doing the Shelby Spin, Drew? 6 or 7. Last 6 or 7 years, they've started up a Shelby Spin for any Shelby vehicle. And so that brings in the newer Mustangs and some of the continuation cars and everything, which is good. Everybody loves it. For 2025 alone, the museum website has seen 23 million hits plus from Facebook, 3.3 million hits on Instagram, and 740,000 views on TikTok. Adult tickets are $15.50. Seniors, youth, first responders, and military, in other words, everybody else on the planet, is cheaper. So now we're going to look at 4 of the cars that are in the museum. Every car in there has a story. As we often say, the cars can't talk, but we can. So I'm going to give you 4 reviews here of a select group of cars, somewhat by age. This is car CSX 2154, a 1963 Le Mans replica. Remember in '63, Shelby had no budget to go to Europe. And there were certainly in the planning stages for 1963, Ford didn't know they were going there either, other than to try to buy a Ferrari. AC Cars called up and wanted Shelby engines to put in their own entries that year for June of '63. And they built 2 cars that they entered. CS, no X because it never came to the United States. CS 2131, which was right-hand drive for 2 British drivers, and CSX 2142, which is left-hand drive for our old friend Ed Hughes and Peter Joe. The latter retired during the race, but 2131 came home 7th overall, 3rd GT, averaged 108 miles an hour for the 24 hours. On the larger note in the picture, the larger side vents, which were part of the AC design for their entry, spats by the front wheel. By FIA rules, you had to cover a certain percentage of the tires. The trunk of the car was modified with a quick fill Monza cap, and the trunk was largely consumed with a 37-gallon racing tank. Remember that the Shelby crew was there, the Ford crew was there, they saw this thing perform, and more or less on the spot, Shelby ordered 3 replicas of this car for use by his team in the last half of 1963. A week or so later, he ordered 3 more, and most cars were to be sold to the public as race cars, finished race cars, and for the first time, this was the first time, that Shelby sold, try more of that. This was the first time that Shelby sold a race car, having not used it as one of his team cars. So, the first batch of cars arrived. A week or so, the subject car in this picture was sold in October of '63 to the governor of South Carolina as a gift for his college-age son. It was air freighted from LAX to Columbia, South Carolina for $695. The kid did pretty well with it in the regional FCCA racing, but the car was wrecked in late '64. The replacement Dad procured was CSX 3010, which was purchased in March of '65 to be used as a street car. It turned out to be impractical for the kid, and he sold it a few months later. Just as an aside, today we have Don Lee with us. So he's still awake, I give him credit. We have Don Lee with us. We purchased CSX 3010 twice. The first time in 1977. The first time in 1977. And he successfully vintage raced the car through August 1986. Don sold it. Don bought the car back in early 2011. And again enjoyed the car on the track and on the Cobra tours until 2016 when he let the car go a second time. But Don, I'm glad to see you here. Yep. Slide 8. This is the 1964 factory Dragon Snake, CSX 2357. There were two Dragon Snakes built by the factory. First in '63 and this one in '64. Both were built by Leonard Parsons and his underlings in the production shop, driven in '63 by Tony Storer and in '64 by Jerry Kirkpatrick. Tony Storer still lives among us. He's in Napa and still repairing transmissions. Jerry Kirkpatrick, what are you thinking?
Get out from under the speaker.
Well, it's this. Jerry Kirkpatrick is still with us, and he's a blacksmith up in Willits, California. So I've talked to both those guys. They got some great stories. There were two shops at Shelby American. Again, at Princeton Drive, it was the offices in the race shop. Across an alleyway was another sublease shop that was called Carter Street. It had a Carter Street address. And the production shop was over there. The guys in the production shop were always jealous because they'd look out across the alley and there goes some race car off to some far-flung event and a bunch of guys with suitcases headed for the airport to go with them. And meanwhile, they were tasked, pardon my French, but it's what they called them, they were tasked with building 3 shit boxes a day in the production department. In any event, looking for something to do other than just build streetcars, Tony Storer and the others in '63 decided they would try to go drag racing. And they pestered Shelby. He finally went to Leonard Parsons and said, look, the kid is bugging me. Tell him he's got a this is '63, he's got a $6,000 budget. I'll loan him the truck, the pickup truck, and the trailer on weekends. He can work on the car in the shop here, evenings and on weekends, but tell him to get back to work making streetcars. So that launched it. In '63, they built a car. It was quite successful. But it got sold out, it got converted back to a streetcar, and early in '64 was sold out from underneath the boys in the shop. Parsons had something in his back pocket, though. He had permission to do another. So he had sent Storer out back to look through the inventory. He literally went eeny, meeny, miny, moe, pulled 2357 out of the pile, and set off to build another drag car. It took him about a month. He and his buddies went to work on the car, evenings and weekends, and as the schedule would allow. And Tony and his buddy finally finished the car one Saturday night at 10 p.m. Tony called Parsons and said, look, we got the car done. Parsons suggested they go shake it down. He reported that he and his buddies spent most of the night street racing anything that would line up with them, terrorizing LA. It would only be, but unfortunately, it would be the only time Tony Storer got to drive the car. He was drafted the next week and would never come back to Shelby American. Jerry Kirkpatrick took over driving the car that summer to many NHRA and AHRA wins. In June of '64, Shelby American received a letter from Ford announcing their intent to sponsor 2357 on the national circuit, so long as Jerry Kirkpatrick was available to drive. He happily had made it out of the production department and he went racing for the rest of the year. When he returned to Shelby American in December, he was reassigned to the GT350 program and spent about 2 weeks welding overrider brackets on the Mustangs before he quit. This is CSX 2409, a 1964 US RRC cutback door car. In late '63 and early '64, Shelby American commissioned a run of 16 289 powered roadsters that became the last iteration of the 289 race cars. Everything that Ford and Shelby had learned about racing Cobras was built into these cars. Chief among the design changes were larger rear fenders. You can see here, much larger rear fenders to allow more rubber, and that caused them to have to change the radius on the door, and so you can see it's cut back. It's kind of the reverse of what the traditional door configuration was. All 16 cars were called the cutback door cars. 5 were built for use in Europe, and those received the famous dimples. Some of them, not all of them, received the famous dimples in the trunk to allow for the FIA suitcase, famously portrayed in the movie Ford versus Ferrari, with the Ken Miles character banging on that trunk lid. For the record, Drew built the aluminum trunk lids that were used in the movie. And one of the cars that we have from the movie in the museum is that car that's been banging out there. 5 of these cars, cutback door cars, were built for domestic use on the US RRC circuit, basically by privateers, as the factory team was all but done at that point. And 6 were built for SCCA production racing. Interestingly, those 6 could not be the team colors. The first 10, either the European or the US cars, were racing blue, guardsman blue, generally speaking. The privateer cars could be any color but that blue. This guy went to Clemson, and so he chose orange, which was their football team color at the time. Graham Shaw was a young man of considerable means, sometimes linked to his grandpa's early investment in Coca-Cola. He raised 300 SLs, Jaguars, and Bow cars, along with other exotic European makes in the 50s. And then he bought his first Cobra, which he kept for a single race, which he won, before selling it that afternoon. Next up was one of Shelby's early team cars, CSX 2129, which Shaw kept for a year and a half before trading it in when he heard about these cars for CSX 2409. Shaw had the car shipped to Watkins Glen for a June 4th US RRC race, where he finished a credible 4th. The guy was no slouch. In a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sweep, the race having been won by Ken Miles. Shaw finished just behind Bob Johnson and just ahead of Hal Keck. He had options for the next weekend. The Firecracker 400 on July 4th at Daytona, where he would attempt to run his Holman Moody powered NASCAR, or prepared NASCAR, or he had the SCCA road race at Lake Garnett, Kansas. He shipped this car to Kansas and flew to Daytona, where he blew the engine up in the NASCAR in practice on Thursday. So he jumped in the plane Thursday night, flew out to Kansas, ran short of fuel in a field before the runway, crashed the plane, got his luggage out, and hitchhiked to the track at Lake Garnett. Next morning in practice, on a very narrow course, the course isn't 25 feet wide. On a very narrow course, he was cut off by an Austin Healey Sprite, if you can imagine, while Shaw was going about 100 miles an hour down the front straight. And Shaw chose not to run into the guy, but went off into the grass. hit a ditch, and flipped the car a couple of times. The result was the wreck of a 6-week-old race car and multiple injuries for Graham Shaw, including a broken back. He ordered his next Cobra from the hospital. It was Dan Gurney's ex-Targa Florio car. And in the end, actually, he pulled the engine from this car and put it in the Targa Florio car. As a result of all this, the boys at Shelby American sent him the team jacket, the blue wool jacket that was around in those days. And rather than put his name on it, they put Tombstone. The guy had finished 4th in a race, blown up an engine in a NASCAR, survived a plane crash, and barely survived a race crash in the course of like 8 days. The last vehicle we're going to look at is called the Admiral's car. And this is a kind of neat story, among many neat stories at the museum. As a junior at service academy, so West Point, Annapolis, the Air Force Academy, and so forth, you're given what's generally called a career loan to help you get set up to move off campus in a year's time. As a senior at the service academies, you're allowed to have a car on campus for the first time. So it was all guys back then. In any event, it took these guys about 10 seconds to figure out I'm getting a cheap loan from the government, and I can have a car next year. And so many of them ordered cars, usually of the performance variety. In the spring of '67, 3 or 4 banks were brought into Annapolis, into a room, with one each local dealer, GM, Ford, Chrysler, etc., at tables to offer cars to the cadets. That spring, that day, at Annapolis, about 350 Corvettes were sold among the 900 cadets. Not everybody buys a car, but anyway. 350 Corvettes were sold. 2 Shelby Mustangs were sold. The class of '68 included Kevin Francis Delaney. The comment under his yearbook picture stated that he had trouble with math and science, which seems tongue-in-cheek, given that the stars on his lapels indicated he finished in the top 50 in his class. Ensign Delaney married his college sweetheart 3 days after graduation. The first plane ride he took was to Pensacola, where he elected to go to the helicopters. He received his wings in August of 1969 and was immediately sent to Vietnam, where he joined the famed Sea Wolves of HAL-3, H-A-L-3, a land-based helicopter unit tasked with protecting the Navy Marine Forces and anyone else in trouble on the Mekong Delta. Delaney flew 686 combat missions. Of the 98 awards he received in his 34 years in the Navy, 64 were combat related, including a Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, 11 Single Action Air Medals, 26 Strike Flight Medals, and 6 Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Crosses. He rose through the ranks and shortly before his retirement in 1998, Admiral Delaney was named to the Navy's regional command as the Navy's regional commander for the Southeast United States and the Caribbean. The best part of the story is that the '68 Shelby GT350 convertible cost about $4,500. The career loan at Annapolis at that point was about $3,500. Kevin Delaney convinced his fiancée, Patricia Moretti, to sell the '65 Chevrolet Impala SS convertible that her dad had given her to cover the $1,000 gap. Rear Admiral Kevin F. Delaney passed away in April of 2015, and by a fortuitous phone call from a great friend of the museum, the late Jeff Berge, the Florida-based car was led to the Cobra experience. It's on display as you see it, with 68,100 Florida miles. It's born with drivetrain and just the right amount of patina. So with that, get the car out of the garage, take a kid for a ride, and come see us at the Cobra Experience. I'm happy to take any questions. Anybody want to, sir?
Just this last week, I encountered a story that the Daytona cars and some of the other Vermont cars were scheduled to be dumped in the ocean, and Alan May or somebody intervened. Is that true?
Mostly true. Snopes would say mostly true. In 65, 3 of the cars were shipped home after their last race. 2 cars remained in Europe, and they were eventually sent back to Alan Mann's shop in England, where in December the tax authorities came around. Cars were imported and exported out of Europe on what's called a carnet. It's basically you are providing a bond that that car will go back to where it came from. And the tax authorities showed up at Alan Mann's shop. These 2 beat up cars were stuck over in a corner. And they said, what are we going to do with these? And a series of options were considered, including dumping those 2 in the ocean. The other 3 were already back in the States. Somebody somehow came up with the money to ship them home. To our good fortune, all 6 of those cars still exist. And they're in the hands of people who don't need the money, so you can't imagine what the value is. Round numbers 20 million, maybe just as a discussion point, but could be a lot more. So mostly true. Anybody else? Sir?
You refer to Cobra as the AC Cobra. What is the AC?
Auto car. This is much to the amusement of the Corvette guys, by the way. Auto car took its name when they were building motorized wheelchairs for World War I veterans. So the Corvette guys that are aware of that tend to get the needle out a little bit. But, we call Corvettes farming when it's on our side. So, yeah, you're welcome. Anybody else? All right, thank you guys. I appreciate your paying attention.
Thank you very much, Brooks. We really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming. Drew, this is Drew. Drew, stand up for a second, everybody. Drew is the owner, starter, everything of the Cobra experience. And if you haven't been there, I'm sure most of you have, but if you haven't been there, please visit it. It's a wonderful spot.